What I'm going to talk about now is the racist Northern heroes. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, politicians removed 168 Confederate symbols last year. Since America's cultural elite argue for more of the same as a reckoning gesture for America's historical white supremacy, perhaps they would like to ponder symbols to Northern racists during the antebellum and Civil War eras. Consider, for example, General William T. Sherman and his statue on the southeast corner of New York's Central Park. Even though he was the war's second most famous Union general, Sherman was a hardened racist. After Lincoln authorized Union armies to recruit blacks in 1863, Sherman did not want them. During his May to September campaign to capture Atlanta in 1864, he did not allow blacks to be combat soldiers in his army. In a letter to his younger brother, Ohio Senator John Sherman, he wrote that blacks, quote, "desert the moment danger threatens. At Shiloh, all of our inward Sherman's servants fled. I won't trust inwards to fight, not yet," close quote. Before he began his Atlanta campaign, Sherman issued an order forbidding the recruitment officers from enlisting blacks. He even warned that any recruiter who did so might be arrested and imprisoned. Despite criticism from his superiors, Sherman refused to change his policy. In July 1864, Lincoln reminded him via telegraph that there was a law in effect regarding black recruitment, and that because it was a law, all must follow it. Although he claimed to have the highest regard for the law, Sherman justified his noncompliance by arguing that nearly all white Union soldiers in his armies had no faith in black combatants. When employed at all, he believed that blacks should be used as laborers, much like they were accustomed to working as slaves. According to historian Michael Fellman, Sherman even lobbied Lincoln indirectly through General-in-Chief Henry Halleck to discontinue black recruitment. He regarded blacks as, quote, "worthless, cowardly, and slothful trash," close quote. He wrote Halleck, quote, "I am honest in my belief that it is not fair to our men to count Negroes as equals," close quote. In addition to his underlying racism thereby revealed, Sherman's conduct was patently insubordinate. He responded to Lincoln's July 1864 "all must follow the law" telegram by replying dismissively, quote, "when I have taken Atlanta and can sit down in some peace, I will convey to you by letter a fuller expression of my views," close quote. The week after claiming he was too rushed to obey Lincoln's order, Sherman reaffirmed his defiant opinion to a Massachusetts recruiting agent. He authorized the agent to share a letter which stated that Sherman opposed black recruitment because, quote, "the Negro is in transition and not yet equal to the white man. I prefer some Negroes as pioneers," meaning road builders, "and cooks and servants, others gradually to experiment in the art of being a soldier with the duties as local garrisons," close quote, but none in his frontline forces. When news of the correspondence spread, Sherman began to feel more pressure from above. He wrote a friend, quote, "I never thought my inward letter would get into the press. I lay low. I like inwards well enough as inwards, but when fools and idiots try to make inwards better than ourselves, I have an opinion," close quote. In the ensuing weeks, Sherman remained furious about black recruitment, often referring to the dangers of enlisting, quote, "inwards and vagabonds," close quote. When Atlanta fell, he wrote to Halleck, quote, "I hope anything I have said or done will not be construed as unfriendly to Mr. Lincoln or to War Secretary Stanton," close quote. He professed that he never intended his letter to the Massachusetts recruiter should be made public. After capturing Atlanta and progressing on his march to the sea ending in Savannah, Sherman remained annoyed with blacks. This time, however, his objections were to the fugitives following his army. During the march, an estimated 25,000 blacks of both sexes and all ages joined the various infantry columns at one time or another. Although at least three-fourths of these turned back, either from weariness or homesickness, others managed to tag along. They became a growing encumbrance as the columns of Sherman's army approached Savannah. Beyond the Ogeechee River, the problem became acute because the land was swampy toward the seaboard. Sherman decided to rid himself, in one way or another, of what might prove to be a military embarrassment in the event of a clash with Confederate infantry, which were at that time falsely rumored to be forming on his northern flank. He was determined to do what he could to disencumber his threatened left of these so-called, quote, useless mouths, close quote. As the Corps commander in that sector approached Ebenezer Creek, he instructed the lagging refugee slaves to first let the Union soldiers construct a pontoon bridge and cross to the far side of the creek so that they might defend the blacks against a rebel force he falsely said to be lurking there. Once the soldiers crossed, however, they cut the bridge moorings, thereby abandoning hundreds of ex-slaves on the opposite bank. Many blacks panicked and tried to rush to the soldiers' shore. Although some succeeded on makeshift rafts, many drowned. The rest were captured by trailing Confederate cavalrymen who returned them to their plantations. Although a subordinate Corps commander was responsible for that incident, Sherman excused the underlings' action as a justifiable military decision under the circumstances. The incident only increased criticism of Sherman. After he captured Savannah, he sought to placate his critics by issuing an order that permitted ex-slaves to settle on the coastal lands between Florida and Charleston, South Carolina. Although represented by many modern academic historians as a racially enlightened gesture that could have changed the course of Reconstruction, Sherman's true objective was to discourage blacks from following his army into South Carolina. According to Gene Daddle's Reckoning with Race book, Sherman, quote, would soon disavow any intention to convey land title to the freedmen, close quote, meaning that he did not intend for the freedmen to get the legendary 40 acres and a mule suggested by some Sherman apologists. Actually, many Sherman apologists. After the Civil War, Sherman took charge of the armies in the Plain States. He promptly put them into service of the transcontinental railroads that wished to have the Indians removed. Dispossession of the Indians, culminating in the late 1880s with the surviving tribes of the West being herded onto reservations, resulted from a corrupt relationship between the government-subsidized railroads and the mostly Republican politicians whose careers they financed and promoted. Sherman's assignment was to eradicate the Indians. Sherman's assignment to eradicate the Indians was a disguised form of corporate welfare. In his own words, quote, "We are not going to let a few thieving, ragged Indians check and stop the progress of the railroads. I regard the railroad as the most important element now in progress to facilitate the military interest on the frontier. We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux," close quote. Sherman wrote to Commanding General Ulysses S. Grant in 1866. Quote, "even to the extermination of men, women, and children," close quote. The Sioux must, quote, "feel the superior power of the government," close quote. Sherman vowed to remain in the West until, quote, until the Indians are all but killed or taken to a country where they can be watched, close quote. Concerning 19th century railroads, perhaps cancel culture warriors may want to get the Stanford University to change its name. Republican politician and railroad tycoon Leland Stanford was the founder. They may also want to consider that the school backtracked on a requirement to provide free tuition to California residents. Under a special 1901 act, the state's legislature gave Stanford a constitutional exemption from property taxes for its 13 square mile campus. That's more than 3 miles by 4 miles. And if you've been to Silicon Valley, as some of you have, you can imagine the value of that property now. If you go to Stanford University, it's a huge campus. And it's completely tax exempt from California property taxes in the Constitution of the state of California. Now, 20 years later, the legislature dropped the free tuition proviso. To be sure, the school's correct name is Stanford Junior University because it is named for Leland Sr.'s only child, who was a boy who died in adolescence. Nonetheless, in addition to being a railroad mogul, the boy's wealthy dad was a Republican California governor and later a U.S. senator from the same state. He was also a racist and a vigorous opponent of immigration. Consider Stanford's remarks in his acceptance speech at the Republican Party's 1859 gubernatorial candidate in California. So this was a year before Lincoln was elected. Here's what he said, quote, "The cause in which we are engaged is one of the greatest in which any can labor. It is the cause of the white man. I am in favor of free white American citizens. I prefer free white citizens to any other race. I prefer the white man to the Negro as an inhabitant to our country. I believe it is the greatest good has been derived by having all the country settled by free white men." Those who try to excuse Stanford's anti-black racism by questioning whether he was speaking sincerely instead of as a politician, they should note that the nominee's opinions were expressed impromptu because he added, quote, "I have not prepared any speech. I come here tonight having framed in my own mind what I should say," close quote. Those spontaneous words were spoken by a man who nearly always spoke publicly from a prepared text. Indeed, he is even accused of being a boring speaker. He was accused of being a boring speaker because throughout his career, he typically read his speeches aloud, I guess like me. Okay, thank you. He lost the 1859 election, but won 2 years later. During his January 10, 1862 gubernatorial inaugural address, he disparaged Chinese Americans. Quote, "The presence of numbers of that degraded people would exercise a deleterious effect upon the superior white race. To my mind, it is clear that Chinese American settlement among us is to be discouraged by every legitimate means. Large numbers are already here, and unless we do something early to check their immigration, the question concerning which of the two tides of immigration, Anglo-Saxon or Chinese, meeting upon the shore of the Pacific, shall be turned back. Which of those two will be forced upon which of those two will be turned back, and that decision will be forced upon our consideration when we are far more difficult than now to dispose of them if we let them continue to grow." their population. When translated into plain words, what he was saying is that it would be hard to get rid of the Chinese if they became a larger share of California's population. Stanford's chief reason for supporting the Republican Party on the eve of the Civil War was to support a northern route transcontinental railroad, for which his Central Pacific would become the prime beneficiary. The candidate clarified in his 1859 nominating speech, quote, "We are in favor of the northern route transcontinental railroad. I am in favor of the railroad, and it is the policy of this state to favor that party which is likely to advance their interests," close quote. Even though a northern route would be more expensive than a southern one because it would need to tunnel through the Sierra Nevada mountains, Stanford's choice, of course, was motivated by the fact that he lived in Sacramento, not Southern California. The economy of taxpayer-funded public works was secondary to his personal prosperity, even at the cost of many Chinese worker lives lost in blasting and construction accidents. Finally, if Stanford's racism is insufficient reason to justify reevaluating his historical status, students may wish to investigate the corruption and bribery that enabled him and his three partners to benefit their Central and Southern Pacific railroads. According to historian Matthew Josephson, they pocketed $36 million in excess profits from taxpayer-funded construction companies that built the Central Pacific. When federal investigators asked to look at the accounting books in 1873, one of Leland's partners told them the books had been destroyed since the road's construction had been completed 4 years earlier. What they had done was they had the railroad pay a construction company which had a monopoly on building the railroad, and the shareholders of the construction company were the same as the shareholders of the railroad, but they could overcharge the railroad because they had a monopoly on the construction. And that's where the extra $36 million in excess profits came from. If today's Californians value the lives and dignity of non-Anglo-Saxon American immigrants, they may wish to scrub Leland Sr.'s name from the memorials in their state. But let us leave the far West to consider the antebellum and wartime racism among political leaders in the region north and west of the Ohio River, which included Abraham Lincoln's state. During his 1831-32 American tour, French nobleman Alexis de Tocqueville found racial prejudice to be strong, quote, "to be stronger in the states where they have abolished slavery than where it still existed, and nowhere stronger than in those states where servitude has never been known," close quote. Among the Midwestern states he visited at that time, the Northwestern states and Midwestern states and territories in that region that never had slavery were Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. Although the same racial prejudices applied to the states and territories of Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota, and ultimately the territories west of the Missouri River. Consider Lincoln's home state of Illinois. In 1830, when Lincoln was 21 years old, about 2% of the state's population was black. When he ran for president 30 years later, in 1860, blacks composed only 0.5% of Illinois residents. As a territory in 1813, Illinois outlawed the incoming of free blacks. Any that did arrive could be punished with 39 lashes every 15 days until they left the state. Although Illinois abandoned the whipping penalty in 1829, it instead required free blacks seeking to enter the state to post a $1,000 bond with proof of their freedom. In 1848, Illinois voters approved black exclusion laws by a 4-to-1 margin. In 1853, the state passed a law that would penalize anyone bringing a free black into Illinois with a fine of $100 to $500 and up to 1 year in jail. In 1859, Illinois Senator, Republican Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull opposed equal rights for blacks. Quote, "We, the Republican Party, are the white man's party. We are for the free white man," close quote. That's a Republican senator from Illinois, 1859. 3 years later, during a Senate discussion concerning wartime slave confiscation and relocation, he said, quote, "Illinoisans want nothing to do with the Negro. They ask, what will we do with them? We do not want them set free to come among us," close quote. Other Illinois politicians agreed. When speaking of lands west of the Missouri River and Texas in 1854, Lincoln said, "The whole nation is interested that the best use shall be made of these western territories. We want them for the homes of free white people." Since the state's wartime governor, Richard Yates, believed that blacks could never compete effectively with whites in the northern economy, he considered emancipation as a method to rid the North of blacks. They would, he erroneously argued, migrate to the South, where their skills were suited to the region's economy. A month after Trumbull's Senate remarks quoted earlier, Lincoln's hometown newspaper and frequent media mouthpiece for him, Springfield's Illinois State Journal, wrote, quote, "The truth is, the N-word is an unpopular institution in free states. Even those who are unwilling to rob them of all the rights of humanity do not care to be brought into the closest contact with them. We now confess that we have this in common with 95% of our people against the N-word," close quote. In August 1861, the Republican-loyal Chicago Tribune wrote, quote, "The great ally of the slaveholders in this country is the apprehension in the northern mind that if the slaves are liberated, they would become a roaming, vicious vagabonds that would overrun the North, and from that day that they were made free, they would cease to work," close quote. After Union armies captured plantations along the lower Mississippi River Valley, Lincoln's war secretary authorized commanders to transfer some ex-slaves upriver to Illinois. In September 1862, the citizens of Pike County, Illinois, forced the refugee train to turn back. Chicago's mayor refused to set up a committee to help resettle the slaves. Governor Yates was reported to have said, quote, "The scattering of those black throngs should not be allowed if it can be avoided. The mingling of blacks among us means we shall always have trouble," close quote. The attitudes of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Iowa, and Wisconsin were similar. Ohio Senator Ben Wade, abolitionist and co-sponsor of the radical Republican Wade Davis Manifesto, personally loathed blacks. In 1863, he remarked, "If we are to have no more slave states, what are we going to do with the excess N-words?" Close quote. 12 years earlier, he had described Washington as a, quote, "God-forsaken, N-word-ridden place," close quote. Wade's companion senator and brother to William T. Sherman, John Sherman, said that Ohioans were, quote, "opposed to having many Negroes among them," close quote. He added that blacks in general, quote, "were spurned and hated all over the country, north and south." And he spoke of the immutable law of God, that whites and blacks will always be separate, or where they are brought together, one will be inferior to the other, close quote. In 1852, he argued that an emancipation bill then under consideration would have triggered black migration northward and, quote, "would have made southern Ohio uninhabitable for whites," close quote. In 1862, the Cincinnati Enquirer editorialized, "Wartime confiscation of slaves would cause, quote, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of slaves to come north and west," close quote, where they would either replace white laborers or, quote, "have to be supported as paupers and criminals at the public expense," close quote. Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Ohioan Salmon Chase, urged that Union General Benjamin Butler emancipate the slaves in his district after the general had occupied New Orleans. Chase's motivation was not noble. He hoped that the northern blacks would migrate to the southern climate. Michigan Republican Senator Jacob Howard opined ex-slaves, quote, ought to be created as equals before the law, close quote, only after he realized that blacks would be contained in the South. In 1862, he was outraged to learn of a relocation plan for 123,000 refugee blacks to his state. In 1858, Republican Congressman George Julian from Indiana admitted, quote, our people hate the Negro with a perfect, if not supreme, hatred. Close quote. Indiana's 1851 Constitution prohibited blacks from entering or settling in the state. Like other Midwesterners, Julian favored black suffrage in the South because he believed it would rid the northern states of blacks where they generally could not vote. Republican Indiana Congressman Albert S. White said, quote, the Anglo-American will never give his consent that the Negro shall be elevated to equality, close quote. Even as the Midwestern states were discouraging black settlement, they actively recruited white European immigrants. Wisconsin placed an immigration commissioner in New York City in 1852. You can see that if you visit Wisconsin today, right? Iowa followed suit in 1860. As a result, white immigration to Wisconsin surged from Ireland, Germany, and Norway. There was never an attempt to entice blacks from the South to Wisconsin or these other Midwestern states. When Lincoln's Interior Secretary suggested in December 1863 that blacks be sent to the far West, where he believed, quote, Negro labor was in great demand, presumably for the railroads, close quote, his party turned him down. The Republicans turned him down. Instead, on July 4th, 1864, the Republicans passed America's first major immigration law, and it was basically targeted at the white Europeans, and that's where the 50 million came over the next 60 years. That July 4th, 1864 law under Lincoln and the Republican Congress is what brought the white immigrants in. It did nothing for the blacks. Wisconsin's Republican Senator James R. Doolittle proposed that Southern blacks all be removed to Florida. He argued that free blacks should be colonized to, quote, keep our Anglo-Saxon institutions and Anglo-Saxon blood pure and uncontaminated, close quote. That is a senator from Wisconsin during the Civil War, one of the most liberal states now. Finally, consider racism in the Northeast. Even though New England was the birthplace of abolition, the typical resident didn't want free blacks as neighbors. Notwithstanding his bona fides as an abolitionist, Massachusetts Governor John Andrew turned down a wartime request from General John Dix to relocate a mere 500 escaped slaves from Virginia to Massachusetts. Governor Andrew of Massachusetts replied to General Dix as follows, quote, for the former slaves to come here for encampment or asylum would be to come as paupers or sufferers into a strange land and climate and into a busy community where they would be incapable of self-help, of a course certain to demoralize themselves and to endanger others, close quote. In plain language, and Governor Andrew was saying that the blacks would not do well in Massachusetts, and the state did not want them. According to historian Gene Daddle, Andrew had wrongly expected, as did many other Northerners, that Southern emancipation would motivate Northern blacks to move south, where, quote, their peculiarities of physical constitution were better suited. A month before the Battle of the Wilderness, in 1864, Congress scorned, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, a proposal by Kentucky Senator Garrett Davis to redistribute refugee blacks among the northern states, quote, in proportion to their white populations, close quote. That same year, it rejected an amendment to the Freedmen's Bureau the Freedmen's Bureau bill. They rejected an amendment to that bill that would have authorized the Bureau to directly contact northern governors and mayors to arrange for black settlements in the North. Notwithstanding their impeccable abolitionist credentials, Massachusetts Republican senators Charles Sumner and Henry Wilson both opposed the initiatives. While I believe that statues to Northern Civil War heroes should remain, I also believe that those of Confederate heroes merit the same respect. Americans should continue adding new statues to commemorate the historical contributions of blacks, but they should reject the wave of destruction targeted at Confederate memorials as a reckless, impudent, and divisive movement. Given today's cancel culture, vandalizing a Confederate memorial requires no more courage than challenging one's grandmother to a cage match. Our respect should be given to those who oppose the tyranny of a one-sided and vindictive zeitgeist.